Hi there. Today, we are going to peel back the golden mask of ancient Egypt and look directly at the strange and often brutal realities that held a 3,000-year-old civilization together. Picture yourself not as a tourist snapping photos of the Great Pyramids, but as a silent observer deep within the royal court at Thebes. The air around you is heavy thick with the sweet smoke of Kai-Fi incense, the dry scent of baked earth, and the faint coppery tang of the nearby Nile. The sun beats down with an intensity you can feel in your bones, a constant reminder of the god Ra from whom your king is supposedly descended. Everything here, from the grandest temple to the smallest amulet, is governed by traditions so ancient, so absolute, that to question them would be like questioning the rise of the sun itself. And frankly, given the lethal political intrigue, the questionable medical practices involving things like crocodile dung, and the sheer number of temperamental gods you have to keep happy, you probably wouldn't survive a single week. But that's what makes it so fascinating from a safe distance. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a small click for you, but it makes a huge difference for the channel. And while you're at it, I'd love to see where and when you're listening from. Go ahead and post your city and the local time in the comments. It's always a quiet thrill to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing in the shade of a carved colonnade, trying to look inconspicuous. Before you, on a raised dais of polished cedarwood, sits the living god, the pharaoh. He is adorned with the symbols of his power: the crook and flail clutched in his hands, the striped Nemes headdress framing his face, and the uraeus, the rearing cobra poised on his brow, ready to spit fire at his enemies. He is the Horus king, the earthly vessel for a divine spirit. But it's the woman beside him who draws your eye. She is the great royal wife, radiant in a sheath of fine linen and a vulture-shaped crown of gleaming gold. Her titles are numerous: Lady of the Two Lands, Sweet of Love, Great of Praises. She is also the pharaoh's full-blooded sister. And to you, a visitor from another time, this fact feels jarring, a violation of a deeply ingrained taboo. But here in the heart of Egyptian power, it is the bedrock of their entire worldview. No one bats an eye. It is not just normal, it is necessary. It is divine. To understand why you have to understand their gods, you can't just read about them in a textbook. You have to feel their stories as the ancient Egyptians did, as living, breathing history. Their core belief, the myth that underpins the entire structure of kingship, is a family drama of love, murder, and magic. It begins with the first generation of gods born from the sky and the earth. Among them are two brothers, Osiris and Set, and two sisters, Isis and Nephthys. Osiris, the wise and just ruler, takes his sister Isis as his wife, and together they bring civilization to the world. But their brother Set is consumed by jealousy. He plots against Osiris, tricks him into a beautifully decorated chest, seals it shut, and casts it into the Nile. Isis, heartbroken, searches tirelessly for her husband's body. She finds the chest, but Set, ever the villain, discovers it. In a rage, he hacks Osiris's body into 14 pieces and scatters them across the length of Egypt. It's a brutal, definitive act of destruction. Yet Isis, in an incredible display of devotion, travels the land gathering every piece of her beloved. Well, almost every piece. As the legend goes, the final crucial part was unfortunately eaten by a particularly hungry fish in the Nile. Awkward, Undeterred, Isis uses her formidable magic to fashion a replacement, binds Osiris's body back together, and breathes life into him just long enough to conceive a son, Horus. This isn't just a story, it's a divine charter. Osiris becomes the king of the underworld, the lord of the afterlife. Isis becomes the model of a perfect wife and mother, the goddess of magic and healing. And their son, Horus, grows up to challenge his wicked uncle Set for the throne of the living. After a series of epic, often violent magical contests, the Council of Gods declares Horus the rightful heir. From that moment on, every pharaoh is the living incarnation of Horus. He is the avenging son, the rightful king, who has restored order or ma'at to the world. So when a pharaoh marries his sister, he is not committing a transgression. He is fulfilling a sacred duty. He is reenacting the perfect divine union of Osiris and Isis. He is ensuring that the throne of Egypt remains, as it was, in the time of the gods, a family affair. This mythological mandate provides a justification so powerful, it's essentially unassailable. To suggest the pharaoh marry a non-royal would be to suggest that the gods themselves got it wrong. But beyond the divine theater, there were intensely practical reasons. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these unions was religious piety or pure political pragmatism. The truth is likely a seamless blend of both. By marrying his sister, the pharaoh kept power, and just as importantly, wealth, locked inside the family. Egypt was fantastically rich, and the royal family was the primary beneficiary. A marriage to the daughter of a powerful noble or a foreign king would create a potential rival. An ambitious father-in-law could get ideas. It's hard to have a scheming father-in-law when your father-in-law is also your father. It simplifies the political landscape immensely. The queen's loyalty is assumed to be absolute because her power is inextricably tied to her brothers. Their blood is the same. This blood was believed to be literally divine, a sacred substance passed down from the sun, god Ra himself. Marrying an outsider, even a high-ranking one, would dilute that holy essence. It's like the universe's most exclusive country club, and the number one rule is no new blood ever. This created a closed loop of power, divinity, and identity that lasted for millennia. The sister queen wasn't just a spouse. She was a critical component in the machinery of kingship, the living Isis, to his Horus, ensuring the cosmic cycle continued undisturbed. This divine and political logic seems flawless, a perfect self-reinforcing circle of power. You watch the pharaoh and his sister queen, and you can see how it all clicks into place: the mythology, the wealth, the absolute authority. It is a closed system designed to be eternal. But as you continue your silent observation, you start to notice things, small details. You notice the way the pharaoh leans just a little too heavily on his ceremonial staff, not as a symbol of office, but as a genuine support. You notice the slight asymmetry in the face of a royal princess peeking from behind her mother's throne. The pursuit of divine purity you are about to discover came at a staggering biological price. The family tree of the gods, when replicated on Earth, didn't grow strong and tall. It grew in on itself, a tangled wreath with no new branches to reach for the sun. Think of a family's bloodline like a great river. In most families, fresh streams and tributaries, marriages to outsiders constantly flow into that river, bringing new currents, new strengths, and washing away any stagnant pools of weakness. This genetic diversity is what keeps the river and the family line healthy and resilient. The royal bloodline of Egypt, however, was engineered to be more like a sealed canal. For generations, the same water was cycled through again and again. And any imperfections floating in that water, any hidden flaws or latent vulnerabilities, were never diluted or washed away. Instead, they were trapped. They became concentrated, passed down from parent to child, brother to sister, uncle to niece, with ever-increasing potency. The very thing they worshipped, the purity of their blood, was becoming a slow-acting poison. We see the grim results of this written directly onto the bones of the pharaohs themselves. Thanks to the Egyptian obsession with mummification and the modern miracle of CT scans and DNA analysis, we can diagnose their ailments thousands of years after their deaths. The famous 18th dynasty, a golden age of Egyptian power and influence, was also riddled with congenital health problems. These weren't just minor inconveniences. They were often debilitating conditions. You'd see cases of scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, that would cause chronic pain. You'd find evidence of cleft palates. And most famously, you'd see Kohler's disease, a rare and painful bone disorder of the foot, often leading to a clubfoot. This is a classic example of a recessive trait, one that might remain hidden for generations in a diverse population, but becomes brutally common when close relatives reproduce. The irony is immense. The pharaoh was expected to be a warrior king, the image of virility and strength leading his armies into battle. But how do you project that image when every step is an agony? How do you stand tall as a living god when your own spine is betraying you? It must have been exhausting trying to look like an all-powerful deity when you probably felt like you needed a week-long nap and several doses of whatever passed for ancient Egyptian pain relief. Beyond the visible skeletal issues, this lack of genetic diversity wreaked havoc on their immune systems. The royal family would have been exquisitely vulnerable to diseases that a common farmer with his more robust genetic heritage might easily fight off. It's the ultimate paradox. They were revered as gods on earth, but they probably had to worry about a case of the sniffles turning into a life-threatening infection more than anyone else in the kingdom. This fragility extended to the most critical function of any dynasty producing heirs. Infant and child mortality rates were likely sky-high within the palace walls. We have found the tiny, heartbreaking mummies of two fetuses buried in Tutankhamun's tomb, believed to be his stillborn daughters. This is a quiet, tragic testament to the struggle. For every healthy heir that was born, how many pregnancies ended in heartbreak? How many royal children died in infancy? Each failure would have mounted immense pressure on the sister queen, whose primary role, beyond ritual, was to secure the dynasty's future. Egyptologists and geneticists still argue about the precise impact of these genetic burdens on the fall of certain dynasties. Did the Amarna period, a time of immense religious and political upheaval, collapse partly because the ruling family had become too biologically fragile to rule effectively? It's a compelling question. When a pharaoh dies young or is unable to produce a male heir, it creates a power vacuum. And in ancient Egypt, a power vacuum was an open invitation for chaos, conspiracy, and the eventual rise of a new, stronger family line to claim the throne. They were so focused on keeping their bloodline pure, they completely missed the biological fine print. Turns out, divine blood is not exempt from the basic rules of Genetics 101. This sacred canal they had built to channel their divinity was becoming choked with weeds. The very practice meant to guarantee their eternal rule was in fact punching holes in the bottom of their dynastic boat, ensuring that sooner or later it was destined to sink. That sinking dynastic boat, leaking from 1,000 tiny holes poked by its own traditions, is more than just a metaphor. It was a reality lived by generations of rulers. And if you want to see the tragic culmination of this entire grand flawed experiment in divine genetics, you need only turn your attention to one figure. He is perhaps the most famous pharaoh of all, but not for what he did in life, but for what he left behind in death. You push past the grand narratives of his golden mask and fabulous treasures, and you look at the boy himself. You look at Tutankhamun. He is not just a king. He is a case study, the final fragile product of a family tree that had forgotten how to branch out. To understand Tutankhamun, you first have to understand the chaotic world he was born into. His father was almost certainly the pharaoh Akhenaten, one of the most controversial and fascinating figures in all of history. Akhenaten was a heretic. He dismantled Egypt's entire religious structure, a complex pantheon with thousands of gods that had been worshipped for well over a millennium. He closed the grand temples at Thebes, fired the powerful priests of Amun-Ra, and declared that there was only one true god, the Aten, the physical disk of the sun. He moved the entire capital to a brand new purpose-built city in the desert called Akhetaten. It was a revolution from the very top, and it sent shockwaves through the deeply conservative Egyptian society. Imagine being a young boy growing up in the middle of that, where everything your ancestors believed was suddenly declared false by your own father. While Akhenaten is almost universally accepted as Tutankhamun's father, the identity of his mother has been a simmering historical debate for decades. The most obvious candidate, of course, was Akhenaten's legendary great royal wife, the beautiful and powerful Nefertiti. For a long time, this was the prevailing theory, but science, as it so often does, complicated the narrative. In a hidden chamber within the tomb of Amenhotep II, archaeologists found a mummy cataloged as KV35YL, simply meaning the younger lady. For years, she was just another anonymous royal. But in 2010, a landmark study of royal DNA sent ripples through the world of Egyptology. The results were stunning. The DNA from the mummy of the younger lady was a match. She was the mother of Tutankhamun. But the tests revealed something even more shocking. She was also the full sister of Tutankhamun's father, the mummy from tomb KV55 believed to be Akhenaten. The boy king wasn't just the product of the royal family's general tradition of incest. He was the direct offspring of a full brother and sister. This was the royal ideal in its most concentrated and most dangerous form. While the DNA evidence seems compelling, historians still argue about the identity of the younger lady. Was she one of Akhenaten's lesser-known secondary wives? Or could she, in a twist, actually be Nefertiti herself, whose own parentage has always been famously murky? We may never know her name for certain, but we know the devastating genetic legacy she and her brother passed on to their son. With a family tree that doesn't fork, you get a bumper crop of health problems. Tutankhamun was the living embodiment of the consequences we talked about earlier. His mummy reveals he had a cleft palate and a slightly curved spine. More seriously, he suffered from that painful bone disease in his foot, which had become necrotic. The tissue was literally dying. He had a severe clubfoot and would have walked with a pronounced painful limp. We know this for a fact because his tomb contained over 130 walking canes, many of them showing clear signs of wear and tear. These weren't just symbols of office. They were essential mobility aids for a king who could not walk unaided. And as if that wasn't enough for one young man to bear analysis of his remains, also found the DNA of Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite that causes the deadliest form of malaria. It was a lethal cocktail of bad genes, bad luck, and bad germs. Here was a king who ruled a vast empire but couldn't win a fight against a common mosquito. Imagine being this boy. You ascend to the throne at the age of 9, physically frail and in chronic pain. Your kingdom is in turmoil after your father's religious revolution, and your entire reign is dedicated to undoing everything he ever did. Of course, the decisions weren't truly his. He was a puppet, his strings pulled by older ambitious men like the General Horemheb and the Vizier Eye. Imagine being 9 years old, and your to-do list isn't finish your homework, but systematically reverse a national religious heresy and restore the entire pantheon of gods your dad just fired. No pressure. He was married, as was the custom, to his half-sister, Ankhesenamun, and their own tragic story, evidenced by the 2 stillborn daughters buried with him, shows the curse continuing down his own short line. His famous golden mask shows the world an image of serene divine perfection. But the reality underneath was a young man who was the poster child for why you shouldn't copy the gods' homework when it comes to marriage, a king whose short, painful life was the bill for generations of genetic gambles finally coming due. The story of the fragile boy king is a stark reminder that the divine mandate had a dark biological undercurrent. But what of the other half of this sacred equation? For every Horus, there must be an Isis. For every pharaoh, there was a sister born and bred for the singular purpose of becoming his great royal wife. You now turn your gaze from the limping Tutankhamun to the young woman who stood beside him, his half-sister, Ankhesenamun. Her life and the lives of all the royal women like her was a path just as rigid and demanding as the pharaoh's, if not more so. Her destiny was not to rule, but to enable rule. She was not trained to be a king, but groomed from the cradle to be the perfect bride for a god. From the moment a princess with the right parentage was born, her life was set on a very specific track. She would have spent her earliest years in the royal nursery, a space known as the care. This wasn't some quiet, secluded wing of the palace. It was a bustling, politically charged environment, often part of a larger harem palace complex. Here she lived among a swarm of other royal children, full siblings, half-siblings from the pharaoh's lesser wives, and even the children of high-ranking officials and foreign vassals who were essentially high-status hostages being raised Egyptian. Her toys would have been the same as any wealthy child's carved wooden animals, clay rattles, and elegantly painted paddle dolls. But her playtime was never entirely free. Tutors, priests, and minders were a constant presence, observing her, instructing her, and gently but firmly molding her. Forget learning your ABCs. Her early lessons were more like Theology 101 and how to not annoy a living God who is also your older brother. It was a very specific and rather intense curriculum. Unlike almost every other woman in Egypt, a future queen had to be literate. The ability to read and write the complex system of hieroglyphs was not a hobby. It was a prerequisite for the job. You can imagine her a small girl with a reed pen in hand, painstakingly copying sacred texts and administrative records onto sheets of papyrus. This was crucial because the great royal wife was not merely a ceremonial figurehead. Powerful queens like Hatshepsut before she became pharaoh, or Queen T. Akhenaten's mother, wielded immense personal and political power. They owned vast estates, managed agricultural lands, oversaw craft workshops, and commanded legions of servants and officials. A queen had to be an executive capable of reading reports and issuing written orders. She was the CEO of her own powerful economic empire within the larger empire of her husband-brother. Even more important than her administrative training was her religious education. This was the core of her being. She had to become a living encyclopedia of ritual. Day after day, she would be drilled by priests, learning the ancient hymns, the correct prayers for every time of day, and her specific, non-negotiable role in dozens of complex state festivals. Her brother was Horus, but she had to become Isis. She needed to understand the mythology not as a story, but as a script that she was required to perform perfectly. When she stood beside the pharaoh in a public ceremony, she wasn't just his wife. She was a cosmic pillar, her presence reassuring the people that the universe was in balance and the gods were pleased. Then, there was the art of presentation. She was taught how to move with a divine grace, how to sit, how to stand, how to project an aura of serene authority. Her public image was a carefully constructed piece of state propaganda. Think of the meticulous care that went into her appearance. The elaborate braided wigs, heavy with scented oils and golden ornaments. The sheath-like dresses of the finest near-transparent linen. And of course, the iconic makeup. The dark kohl eyeliner wasn't just a fashion statement. It was believed to possess potent magical power, a protective shield against evil spirits and curses. As a quirky little bonus, we now know the lead-based compounds in the kohl had mild antibacterial properties and helped deflect the harsh glare of the desert sun. Her daily makeup routine was a fusion of branding magic and practical public health. But what of the personal relationship? Historians still argue whether these sibling unions were genuinely affectionate partnerships or simply cold political contracts. Looking at the art from Tutankhamun's tomb, you see tender, intimate scenes. Ankhesenamun anoints his collar with perfume, joins him on a hunting trip, and presents him with flowers. These images suggest a real bond, a shared affection in a life of immense pressure. Other royal marriages were likely far more pragmatic. Dating must have been simple. No awkward first encounters when you've known the guy since you were both in diapers. On the other hand, you can never really break up. He's the pharaoh, and your brother. It's complicated. Her marriage, which would have taken place when she was in her early teens, was the final formal step in her lifelong grooming. It wasn't the beginning of a romance, but the assumption of an office. From birth, she was a sacred vessel, her life's purpose to nurture the pharaoh, reflect his divine light, and above all else, attempt to bear the next generation of that pure, potent, and tragically cursed bloodline. So there you have it, the perfect celestial couple, meticulously groomed for their roles seated on the throne of the two lands. The living Horus and his Isis queen brother and sister, husband and wife. The cosmic machinery, lubricated by ritual and myth, should be running perfectly. The kingdom should be a reflection of this divine harmony, prosperous, orderly, and eternal. But you, the silent watcher, feel a subtle shift in the air. The incense still burns, the gold still gleams, but a discordant note has been struck. What happens when the messy, unpredictable real world refuses to follow the divine script? What happens when the first hairline crack appears in that flawless golden facade? The entire legitimacy of the pharaoh rests on a single crucial concept, ma'at. We often translate it as order or justice, but it's so much more than that. Ma'at is the fundamental universal principle of balanced truth and cosmic harmony. It's the force that keeps the stars in their courses, the sun rising every morning, and the world from collapsing into chaos. The pharaoh's number one job, his entire reason for being, is to uphold Ma'at on earth. He is the sole intermediary between the gods and humanity. It's the ultimate performance review. If the harvest is bountiful and the borders are secure, it's proof that the pharaoh is doing his job correctly and the gods are pleased. If things go wrong, well, the consequences are a bit more severe than a bad quarterly report. The divine buck stops with him. The first and most terrifying crack almost always appeared along the banks of the Nile. The entirety of Egyptian civilization, its wealth, its food, its very life was utterly dependent on the river's annual inundation. Every summer, monsoon rains deep in Africa would swell the river, causing it to flood its banks in Egypt and deposit a layer of rich black, incredibly fertile silt. This was their gift from the gods. But the gift was conditional. If the flood was too low, the silt wouldn't reach far enough. The fields would remain barren sand, leading to drought, failed harvests, and eventually mass famine. If the flood was too high, it was just as catastrophic, washing away homes, drowning livestock, and destroying the critical network of dikes and canals. The ancient Egyptians measured the flood levels religiously using clever structures called nilometers, staircases, and pillars built right into the riverbank with markings to record the water's peak. The priests would read these levels like a stock market ticker, and the results would dictate the tax rates and predict the prosperity for the coming year. A single bad flood could be endured, but 2 or 3 in a row. The people wouldn't blame regional weather patterns. They would look to the palace. The pharaoh has clearly failed to properly appease Hapi, the god of the inundation. The first whispers would begin, "The king is weak." And who do you think is standing there, reading the nilometer and interpreting its meaning for the masses? The priests. As you drift from the palace to the great temple complex at Karnak, you hear the change in tone. The whispers start here in the cool, shadowy halls where the true nature of power is understood. Perhaps the pharaoh has been neglecting his offerings to Amun-Ra. Perhaps he promoted an official the priesthood dislikes. Suddenly, every misfortune gets a religious spin. A plague among the cattle isn't just a disease. It's a sign of divine displeasure. A sandstorm is not just weather, it's a celestial warning. Historians still argue about the extent to which priests actively manipulated these omens to exert political pressure, or if they genuinely believed their own dire interpretations. Either way, the result was the same. The king's authority was being subtly but surely undermined by the very men tasked with upholding it. Then comes the trouble from outside. A strong pharaoh projects power, and Egypt's neighbors know to be respectful. But when they get wind of internal strife, of famine, of whispers in the temples, they get bold. A messenger arrives at the court dust-caked and exhausted with news that Libyan tribes have raided an oasis in the western desert. Another report comes from the south. The Nubian chieftains are refusing to send their annual tribute of gold and ivory. It's hard to maintain that all-powerful living God vibe when you keep losing border forts to a bunch of guys in chariots. A single military defeat can be spun as a strategic retreat. A pattern of them suggests the pharaoh's divine mojo is failing. The gods of Egypt no longer grant him victory. These cracks rarely appear alone. They feed into each other in a vicious cycle. The failed harvest leads to civil unrest. The unrest encourages foreign enemies. The military losses further erode the people's faith. This is when you might see a frantic increase in a very specific kind of ritual magic. Archaeologists have found troves of what are called execration texts. These were curses against named enemies of the state, a rebellious prince in Nubia, the entire Hittite royal family, or even abstract concepts like all evil speech and all evil thoughts. These names were written on clay figurines or pots, which were then ceremonially bound, smashed, burned, and buried. A sudden spike in the production of these cursed objects is like a declassified intelligence report. It tells you the palace is getting deeply, deeply worried. The divine facade is crumbling, and the pharaoh once a god is starting to look all too human. His celestial approval rating is plummeting, and there are no spin doctors to fix it. Only priests with long faces and generals who are suddenly taking a very keen interest in contingency planning. Those generals with their quiet contingency planning and the priests with their somber knowing glances aren't just preparing for a difficult season. They are the human instruments of a cosmic verdict. The cracks in the facade you noticed earlier are no longer just signs of weakness. They are becoming gaping holes, and the very foundations of the pharaoh's power are beginning to wash away. The whispers have escaped the confines of the temple and are now carried on the dusty winds through the markets and the barracks. The king's divine mandate, that sacred right to rule granted by the gods, is not a lifetime guarantee. It's a conditional loan, and the celestial bank is about to call it in with interest. You see, a pharaoh doesn't rule simply because he was born into the right family. He rules because he is actively and constantly chosen by the gods to be their representative. His reign is a continuous audition to maintain Ma'at. When the crops fail and the armies fall, it is seen as a breach of contract. The universe is out of balance, and the people from the highest noble to the lowliest farmer begin to believe that a change is not just possible, but necessary to restore order. It's less a job for life and more a job for as long as the universe agrees with your management style. And the divine HR department is notoriously ruthless. You can feel this change in the mood of the people. Leave the paranoid confines of the palace and walk through the workers' village of Deir el Medina home to the artisans who build the royal tombs. A few years ago, the walls here would be covered in cheerful graffiti and hymns praising the pharaoh's generosity. Now the mood is sullen. The grain shipments from the state granaries, their monthly wages, have been late. Then they stop coming altogether. We know for a fact this happened. The Turin Strike Papyrus, the world's first ever documented labor dispute, records the artisans during the reign of Ramesses III, laying down their tools and marching on the mortuary temples, shouting the desperate and defiant words, "We are hungry." This is an earth-shattering event. These are not slaves. They are respected state employees, and they are publicly accusing the pharaoh's government of failing its most basic duty to provide. The man who is meant to be a god cannot even feed the men who are building his eternal home. The magic is starting to wear off. Back in the court, the atmosphere is thick enough to choke on. The smiles of the courtiers are brittle, their bows a fraction too deep, their eyes never quite meeting the pharaoh's. Loyalty has become a treacherous, shifting sand. The elite are making their calculations. That victorious general, you saw the one with the popular support of his army. He now portrays himself not as a rebel, but as a patriot. He argues that his loyalty is to Egypt, to Ma'at, and that the current king is the one endangering the state. The high priest, who once read omens of the king's greatness, might now rediscover a cryptic ancient prophecy that speaks of a time of chaos that will be ended by a great man from a humble background, a man who just so happens to look remarkably like that popular general. The court suddenly has all the warmth and trust of a rattlesnake convention. Everyone is smiling, and everyone is trying to figure out which of the other smiles is hiding the sharpest knife. The final tipping point can be anything: a humiliating peace treaty, a plague that sweeps through the capital which is seen as the king's fault, a public ritual where something goes disastrously wrong, a sacred animal refusing to cooperate, a sudden storm interpreted as the gods publicly turning their backs on him. Historians still argue about the moment a pharaoh truly lost his mandate. Was it a single catastrophic event that shattered his prestige, or was it a slow creeping erosion of faith that finally became unstoppable like a flood cresting a weak levee? Often, the final moment is simply when a conspiracy, which has been brewing for months, finally decides to act. They might use the pharaoh's birth name, his Ren, in powerful curses, believing they can attack his soul directly. The belief in his divinity has not just vanished, it has inverted. He is no longer the protector of the people. He is the source of the curse afflicting the land. Picture the pharaoh himself in his private chambers at night. The heavy crowns and golden collars are put away. The divine makeup is washed off. He is just a man. Maybe he's a young man, frail and overwhelmed, like Tutankhamun. Maybe he's an old man who has seen his luck run out. But he's no fool. He can feel the coldness. He sees the way his own bodyguards watch him. The silence that falls when he enters a room is no longer one of respect, but of judgment. The divine mandate isn't just gone. He can feel it, actively settling on the shoulders of his rival. He is no longer the living Horus, the hawk god triumphant. He is a mortal, a target, and the hunter is circling. He's gone from being the sun god's chosen one to being the kingdom's most prominent see something, say something target. And in the shadows of the palace, everyone is seeing something. The hunter, whether it's a rival general, a cabal of scheming priests, or simply the crushing weight of famine and failure, has finally struck. The pharaoh, who was once a god, is now a corpse. The conspirators have won. A new Horus sits on the throne, and the kingdom breathes a collective sigh of relief, hoping for a return to balance. But you would be mistaken to think that death is the ultimate punishment for a failed king. For an ancient Egyptian, death was merely a transition, a doorway to an eternal afterlife. The true horror, the most profound and chilling curse imaginable, was not the act of dying, but the act of being made to have never existed at all. To understand this, you have to understand what it meant to be a person in ancient Egypt. It was far more complex than just a body and a soul. They believed a human being was a composite of many parts. You had the cat, the physical body that needed to be preserved through mummification. You had the ka, the vital life force or spiritual twin, which needed offerings of food and drink to survive after death. You had the ba, your unique personality or spirit, often depicted as a human-headed bird, which could travel between the tomb and the world of the living. And then you had the two most vulnerable and most crucial components, your shut or shadow and your ren, your name. Your name and your image were not just labels or pictures. They were fundamental parts of your being, metaphysical anchors that tethered your soul to existence. As long as your image was visible and your name was spoken, you were eternal. If they were destroyed, your soul with nothing to hold on to would dissolve into the void. It was utter annihilation. This is the curse of being erased. The Romans would later have a name for it, damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory, but the Egyptians perfected it centuries before. You are now watching as the curse is enacted. The new pharaoh has given the order. Squads of stonemasons armed with copper chisels and heavy mallets are dispatched to every corner of the kingdom. You stand before a towering temple pylon covered in magnificent reliefs, celebrating the reign of the now disgraced king. The masons get to work. You hear the sharp, rhythmic tink, tink, tink of metal on stone, a sound that will echo across the land for months, even years. They focus their efforts on the cartouches, those distinctive oval ropes that enclosed and protected the king's name. With methodical precision, they chip and grind the sacred hieroglyphs away, leaving a rough, empty scar where the wren once resided. They move to the towering statues, and instead of toppling them, they climb ladders and begin hammering away at the face, deliberately mutilating the nose. It was believed a statue's spirit could breathe, and destroying its nose was a way of symbolically suffocating it for all eternity. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a ritual execution. No one was safe from this posthumous wrath, not even one of Egypt's most successful rulers. The female pharaoh Hatshepsut reigned for over 20 years, bringing peace and immense prosperity. Yet late in the reign of her stepson and successor Thutmose III, the order was given. Her name was scraped from temple walls. Her magnificent obelisks were walled in to hide them from view, and thousands of her statues were systematically smashed to pieces and dumped in a pit near her stunning mortuary temple. Historians still argue fiercely about Thutmose III's motivation. Was it the petty revenge of a man who felt his stepmother had usurped his rightful place for 2 decades, or was it a cold, calculated political decision to remove the unnatural precedent of a female king, thereby restoring what he saw as the proper order of Ma'at? The erasure of the heretic king Akhenaten was even more thorough. His successors sought to wipe out every trace of his religious revolution. They didn't just chisel out his name. They dismantled his temples and used the decorated blocks, the talatat, as anonymous filler material inside the walls of their own new constructions. In later official king lists, his name and the names of his immediate successors, including Tutankhamun, were simply omitted as if their reigns never happened. He was referred to in records not by his name, but only as the enemy, or that criminal of Akhenaten. It was the ultimate bad review. They didn't just give him 1 star. They tried to pretend the entire restaurant had never even existed. Sometimes, however, the process was done on the cheap. Rather than go to the trouble of quarrying and carving a whole new statue, a later pharaoh would simply have his own name and titles carved over the cartouche of a previous king. Ramesses the Great was particularly famous for this, usurping countless monuments. It's the ancient equivalent of putting a sticker with your name over the property of label on something you took from someone else. It was a terrifyingly personal and complete form of destruction, aimed at ensuring a fallen ruler had no peace in this world or the next. It's the cosmic equivalent of not just deleting someone's social media profile, but hacking the server to erase their data, burning their birth certificate, and convincing history they were nothing more than a collective bad dream. That methodical, chilling erasure of a soul is a punishment inflicted on a memory, a bureaucratic curse carried out with chisels and hammers long after the fact. But the fate of the man himself in those terrifying, chaotic hours when the throne is being ripped from his grasp is often a far messier and more visceral affair. The cosmic verdict we spoke of is not delivered by a gentle hand. It arrives at the point of a spear. You are now a witness to the final bloody moments of a failing reign, watching a rival's vengeful ascent from the shadows of a palace in turmoil. The air is electric with fear and violence. The muffled shouts you heard from a distance have become a roar echoing down the grand colonnades. The clash of bronze on bronze rings through the corridors. The pharaoh's personal guard, the Medjay, have been betrayed from within or simply overwhelmed. In the throne room, or perhaps cornered in his own private chambers, the living god finds himself suddenly terrifyingly mortal. The bowing servants are gone, either fled or dead. The sycophants and courtiers have melted away. All that is left is the king and the architects of his downfall, the ambitious general, the treacherous vizier, their faces grimly triumphant in the flickering torchlight. All those years of divine ritual and sacred pronouncements have boiled down to this one brutally simple meeting with the new management. And they are not here to discuss a severance package. Before the final blow, there is humiliation. A usurper's first task is to publicly shatter the divine aura of the man he is overthrowing. It's a crucial piece of political theater. You watch as the rival general, his armor still splattered with the blood of loyal guards, rips the crook and flail from the pharaoh's hands. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt is pulled from his head and cast to the floor. The intricate gold collars and sacred amulets are torn from his neck. He is stripped down to a simple linen kilt, no different from any other man. The act is symbolic and deeply powerful. You are not a god. You are just flesh and bone. He might be dragged out and forced to kneel before his rival in front of the very courtiers, who just hours before would not have dared to even meet his gaze. So what happens next? What is the ultimate fate of the man who is king? The official histories written by the victors are almost always silent or deliberately vague on this point. A new pharaoh wants to project an image of a smooth, divinely ordained transition, not a bloody coup. Because the official records are so sanitized, historians still argue about the final moments of many pharaohs who were clearly overthrown. Was it a swift blade in the night, a cup of poison, or a convenient death in a remote prison that could be blamed on illness? Assassination is the most brutally efficient option. We have grim proof of this in the famous harem conspiracy against Rameses III. While the plot was officially thwarted and the conspirators put on trial, the mummy of the king tells a different story. A CT scan revealed a deep, lethal slice across his throat, hidden for millennia by his burial wrappings. The plotters, including one of his lesser wives, who wanted her son on the throne, succeeded in their primary goal. The trial was just cleanup by the legitimate heir. Sometimes a slightly cleaner path was chosen, forced suicide. The deposed king might be handed a dagger or a cup of potent poison and left alone in a locked room. This allowed the usurper to claim the old king took his own life out of shame, neatly absolving him of the taboo of regicide. The rival's vengeance rarely stopped with the king. His ascent requires a total consolidation of power. A brutal purge of the old guard is inevitable. The new pharaoh has a zero-tolerance policy for anyone whose resume includes trusted advisor to the last guy. The former vizier, the loyal generals, the chief priests who refused to join the conspiracy, they are all rounded up. Their fates are swift, a quiet execution forfeiture of all property, or if they're lucky, exile to a miserable outpost in the farthest reaches of the desert. The new king cleans house, installing his own men in every position of power, from the head of the treasury to the captain of the palace guard. The most dangerous loose ends, however, are the king's own family. His sons carry the sacred blood and represent a potent living claim to the throne. They are magnets for any future rebellion. Their fate is almost always a sad and silent one. But for the women of the fallen king's family, a different and perhaps more chilling fate could await. A common way for a usurper from outside the royal line, like a successful general to legitimize his new reign, was to forcibly marry the widow or eldest daughter of the man he just overthrew. The powerful official Ai, who succeeded Tutankhamun, almost certainly married his young widow Ankhesenamun to cement his claim. It's a grimly pragmatic move. It's also the ultimate power play. My apologies about your husband's unfortunate demise. Now the coronation is on Tuesday. I trust you'll be ready. It must have made for some very tense family dinners. So the rival has won. The bloody coup is over, the purges are complete, and a new triumphant pharaoh sits on the throne of Egypt, perhaps, with the widow of his predecessor at his side. He is the image of absolute power, the living God, the master of all he surveys. But as he settles into his new role, his gaze inevitably drifts from the palace to the towering pylons of the great temples that dominate the horizon. He looks towards the sanctuary of Amun-Ra, at Karnak, a city of stone dedicated to the king of the gods. He is king, yes, but he knows that the men in the pristine white linen robes, the priests, were his silent partners in this violent enterprise. And he is keenly aware that allies powerful enough to put you on the throne are powerful enough to remove you from it. To truly understand the precarious nature of kingship, you must leave the court and enter their world, the shadowy, influential, and fabulously wealthy domain of the Egyptian priesthood. You step through the temple gates, leaving the noise and dust of the outside world behind. The air here is different, cooler, quieter scented with incense and old stone. This is not just a church. It is the headquarters of a massive corporation, a center of intellectual life, and the only authorized communication channel to the gods. The power the priests wield is not merely spiritual. It is threefold, a potent trinity of wealth, knowledge, and divine access. First, and perhaps most importantly, the priests were landlords. By the height of the New Kingdom, historians estimate that the great temple cults, particularly the cult of Amun-Ra, owned as much as 1/3 of all the arable land in Egypt. Think about that. 1 out of every 3 fertile fields was in essence temple property. But it didn't stop there. They owned vast herds of cattle fleets of trading ships that sailed to Lebanon for cedar and Punt for exotic goods and the rights to rich mines and quarries. They collected their own taxes from their tenants, paid in grain beer and linen, which filled their colossal storehouses to bursting. The high priest of Amun wasn't just a religious figure. He was a combination of a modern-day central bank governor, a multinational CEO, and the biggest real estate mogul in the country. When he spoke, his words carried the immense weight of economic leverage that could challenge the pharaoh himself. Second, the priests held a near monopoly on knowledge. In a society where the vast majority of the population was illiterate, the temples were the universities, the libraries, and the research labs. It was here that scribes were trained learning the thousands of complex hieroglyphs. He who controls the records controls the narrative, and the priests controlled nearly all of it, from legal contracts to the sacred histories of the kings. They were also the nation's doctors and scientists. Priestly physicians blended practical treatments with magical spells, creating a potent and sought-after form of healthcare. They were the astronomers tracking the movements of the stars to maintain the all-important calendar, which dictated the timing of religious festivals and the agricultural cycle. They could literally tell the entire nation what day it was and when to plant their crops. This gave them an authority that felt absolute and derived from the heavens themselves. They were essentially the divine IT department. A pharaoh could ask why the gods were angry, and the priests could calmly reply, "Have you tried restarting your reign with a major festival and a pious donation of 10,000 head of cattle to our temple? The gods have indicated that usually fixes the connection." To maintain this sacred authority, priests lived under a strict code of purity that set them visibly apart. You would see them, but you would never mistake them for a common man. They had to be circumcised. To avoid lice or any other impurity, they would shave their entire bodies, head face, even eyebrows and eyelashes every 2 or 3 days. They wore robes of only the purest white linen and sandals made from woven papyrus, as anything made from animals like leather was considered unclean for use within the temple precinct. This stark clean appearance was a constant visible reminder of their special status. Finally, and most obviously, they held the keys to the kingdom of the gods. While the pharaoh was the chief priest of Egypt in theory, the day-to-day work of keeping the universe running fell to them. They were the only ones permitted to enter the dark heart of the temple, the sanctuary of the god, to perform the daily rituals of washing clothing and feeding the cult statue. They were the ones who interpreted the dreams, the omens, and the oracles. Their spiritual power gave them a direct line to the king's conscience and his legitimacy. Historians still argue whether the rise of the high priests of Amun at the end of the New Kingdom represented a deliberate aggressive power grab or a necessary move to fill a power vacuum as the authority of the pharaohs weakened. The result, however, is undisputed. The high priest Herihor became so powerful in the south that he adopted full pharaonic titles, writing his name in a cartouche and ruling as a king in all but name. The shadow government had finally stepped into the light. It's the ultimate promotion, really. After centuries of being the power behind the throne, they simply decided to cut out the middleman. The priest's power over the living, culminating in one of their own, taking the throne, seems absolute. But their influence didn't stop at the edge of the cultivated land, or even at the palace gates. Their most profound, most mysterious, and perhaps most essential power was exercised in the place where life ended and eternity began. To see the priesthood's true grip on the soul of Egypt, you must follow them across the Nile to the West Bank, the land of the setting sun, the vast and silent necropolis that housed the dead. Their power over the state was formidable, but it was their monopoly on the afterlife that made them truly indispensable. You are now part of a solemn funeral procession. A great noble, perhaps, even the pharaoh himself, has died. The lengthy 70-day process of mummification is complete. The body, skillfully dried with natron salts, anointed with fragrant oils, and wrapped in hundreds of yards of pristine linen, is now a perfect eternal vessel. But it is an inert vessel, a beautiful lifeless doll. It cannot see the glorious paintings on its own tomb walls. It cannot hear the wails of the mourners. It cannot speak the magical passwords needed to navigate the underworld. And it cannot taste the eternity's worth of food and drink offerings being piled up in its honor. The mummy is a locked house, and the priests are the only ones who hold the key. At the entrance to the tomb, beneath the hot white sun, the mummy is stood upright. The air is thick with the sound of ritual wailing from professional mourners, women hired to play the roles of the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, throwing dust on their hair and crying out in stylized grief. But the main event is about to be performed by a Siam priest identifiable by the leopard skin he wears over his white linen robes, and a high-ranking lector priest who carries a papyrus scroll containing the sacred script. This is the final and most critical stage of the journey, a complex and deeply strange ceremony known as the wep-ro, the opening of the mouth. This wasn't a single simple action. It was an elaborate liturgy, a piece of high ritual theater with as many as 75 distinct acts. It began as most Egyptian rituals did with purification. The lector priest sprinkles the mummy with water, blessed with natron, washing away the last impurities of the mortal world. He wafts clouds of fragrant incense consecrating the space. Then the special toolkit is brought forth. It's a bizarre collection of implements, a flint knife shaped like a fishtail, called the peseshkoff. A ritual adds a tool normally used by carpenters and sculptors, a serpent-headed blade, and most shockingly, the freshly severed foreleg of a calf. The lector priest begins to chant the ancient spells, his voice a low drone in the desert silence. He or the Sem priest then approaches the silent shrouded figure. Following the script on his scroll, he touches the mummy's face with the ceremonial adze. He touches the mouth, the eyes, the nose, the ears. It's the most intense tech support call imaginable, a priest trying to methodically reboot the mummy's sensory hardware. Can you see me now? Can you hear me now? Each touch is accompanied by a specific prayer, magically reawakening that sense. This ritual wasn't exclusively for mummies. It was also performed on the cult statues of the gods when they were first placed in their sanctuaries, and even on the temples themselves. The purpose was always the same: to animate the inanimate, to allow a physical object to become a living vessel for a spirit. Then comes the most visceral and to our eyes disturbing part of the ceremony. A calf, specially chosen, is brought forward. Its leg is bound, and while the animal is still alive, a priest swiftly cuts off its foreleg. This bleeding, still warm limb is then held up to the mummy's mouth. Sometimes the calf's heart was also offered. The logic behind this, a form of potent sympathetic magic, was that the vibrant life force from the fresh sacrifice would be directly transferred to the deceased, kickstarting their own renewed existence. Historians and theologians still argue about whether the ancient Egyptians believed the priest was symbolically or literally opening the senses. Was this a powerful metaphor for the soul's awakening in the afterlife? Or did they believe that the priest's actions and the calf's sacrifice had a direct, tangible, magical effect on the corpse itself? The raw physicality of the ritual strongly suggests they believed it was very, very real. Without this ceremony, the deceased would be trapped for eternity in a silent, dark, unfeeling prison, unable to partake in the afterlife's pleasures. It would be like having a front row seat at the most glorious banquet ever conceived, but being tied to your chair with your eyes closed and mouth sealed. A truly hellish existence. With the final prayer uttered, the mummy is now considered activated. Its senses are restored. It can now speak the spells from the Book of the Dead, see its path through the underworld, and enjoy the offerings left by its family. The now living mummy is placed within its nested series of coffins and sarcophagi and sealed in the burial chamber. The priests have done their job. They have served as the ultimate travel agents for the afterlife, proving once again that without their secret knowledge and their disturbing rituals, even a pharaoh would be nothing more than a blind mute ghost lost to the ages. The priests are the masters of the soul's journey, the indispensable guides who activate the senses and unlock the gates to a blissful eternity. Their rituals bring comfort, purpose, and the promise of life everlasting. But their profound understanding of the universe's hidden currents, the force the Egyptians called Heka or magic, was not reserved solely for benevolent ends. This same power had a much sharper, much darker, and far more violent application. You now turn from the solemn dignity of the tomb to a secluded temple workshop where a very different kind of ceremony is underway. This ritual is not meant to preserve and reanimate a soul, but to attack, weaken, and utterly shatter a living enemy. To the ancient Egyptians, magic wasn't supernatural. It was a fundamental force of nature, a kind of divine physics that was woven into the fabric of creation. Heka was a tool like fire or water that could be used to build or to destroy. Priests with their secret knowledge and rigorous training were the foremost masters of this cosmic technology. While they used it to heal the sick and guide the dead, they also weaponized it in service of the state. You are about to witness an act of official state-sponsored magical warfare. In a dusty, restricted courtyard, a lector priest is at work. He is not preparing fine linens or precious oils, but crude, mass-produced materials, lumps of wet clay beeswax, and stacks of cheap red pottery bowls. He begins to mold the clay into small, rough human figures. They are generic, with stubby limbs and blank faces, but he gives them an identity by taking a sharp stylus and scratching names into the wet clay. These are the names of the pharaoh's enemies. This is the ultimate burn list. The names include foreign rulers, the Prince of Kush, the King of the Hittites, and entire peoples like the Libyans, or the nomadic tribes of Sinai. But most tellingly, the lists also include domestic threats. Any Egyptian who might rebel, any official who might plot, any scribe who might spread evil words. They even sought to curse abstract concepts, the very seeds of dissent, like all bad dreams, and every thought of rebellion. It's like trying to put a curse on the concept of Mondays. Ambitious, certainly. Once the names are inscribed, capturing the essence, the ren of the enemy, the ritualized assault begins. The clay figurines, now imbued with the identity of their targets, are treated as prisoners of war. Their arms are twisted and bound behind their backs. The priest might symbolically spit on them or douse them in unclean fluids. Then he takes a bronze nail or a sharp knife and pierces the figurine through the heart, the head, or the limbs, all while chanting potent curses. The wax figures might be slowly melted over a fire, their forms twisting and dissolving, as the priest incants spells of destruction. It's far more hands-on than just subtweeting your enemies. It's a divinely sanctioned rage room. The red pots are next. Inscribed with long lists of targeted individuals and groups, they are held up and then deliberately smashed on the ground, shattering into dozens of pieces. The symbolic violence is clear. Just as this pot is broken, so too will the power of the pharaoh's enemies be broken. The shards and the mutilated figurines are then carefully gathered. We have found the archaeological proof of these activities. At the Egyptian frontier, fortress of Mirgissa in Nubia, a pit was discovered containing the remains of just such a ritual, hundreds of shattered red pots, figurines pierced with nails, and even a human skull that had been used as part of the curse. So, what did they believe they were accomplishing? Historians still argue, whether these rituals were seen primarily as a form of psychological warfare, a way to formalize hatred and boost the morale of Egyptian soldiers before a campaign, or if they believed they were launching a genuine magical attack that could cause real harm from afar. Given their worldview, where the name and the image were integral parts of the soul, the answer is almost certainly both. They believed the magic was real and devastating. They were attacking the enemy's caw, their life force, sowing confusion, illness, and discord. It was a magical softening up, a supernatural artillery barrage launched by the priests before the army ever marched. This high-level state magic also trickled down to the common citizen. While you probably couldn't get a temple priest to curse your noisy neighbor, you could hire a lesser magician or scribe to create a more personal curse tablet, often inscribed on a thin sheet of lead. These curses would target rivals and business enemies in a lawsuit, or the new lover of a former partner. Magic, both creative and destructive, was an integral part of life at every level. The execration ritual is now complete. The broken pieces are swept up and taken to be buried in a special place near the hostile border they were targeting, or in a cemetery, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, allowing the curse to seep into the underworld. You see now another facet of the priest's power. They were not just scholars and guides. They were the pharaoh's secret weapon, his magical special forces waging a constant hidden war to protect the two lands from all enemies, foreign, domestic, and even imaginary. You really did not want to get on their bad side. They wouldn't just block you. They would write your name on a pot, smash it to pieces, and bury it next to a haunted tomb. It takes things to a whole new level. Waging magical war on the pharaoh's enemies was one of the priesthood's more dramatic services to the state. But brute force, even supernatural brute force, was not always the answer. A far more subtle and ultimately more influential method of control involved not sending messages of destruction out into the world, but receiving cryptic messages from it. The priests were the masters of an ancient and powerful information technology, the oracle. To understand this quiet manipulative power, you must leave the familiar banks of the Nile behind. You join a caravan, your face wrapped against the sun, and sand for a long and punishing journey deep into the Libyan desert. You are heading for the remote, legendary Siwa oasis, a splash of impossible green in a sea of endless sand, a place where the gods themselves were said to speak. The journey itself was part of the magic. For weeks you trudged through a landscape of shimmering heat and desolate silent dunes. The remoteness was a filter. Only the desperate, the powerful, or the truly devout would undertake such a quest. This hardship amplified the mystique and authority of what lay at the journey's end, the temple of the oracle of Amun. This was Amun, the great king of the gods, but worshipped here in a unique local form, fused with an ancient Libyan ram-headed deity. This oracle became so famous that its influence spread far beyond Egypt's borders. Greeks, Persians, and Romans would one day make the same arduous trek. The oracle's most famous visitor was Alexander the Great. In 331 BC, after conquering Egypt, he made the perilous journey to Siwa. There the high priest greeted him not as a foreign conqueror, but as the son of Amun himself. This single proclamation legitimized his rule over all of Egypt and cemented Alexander's own growing belief in his personal divinity. But how did it actually work? When you finally arrive dusty and exhausted, you don't just get to walk up and ask your question. There are days of purification, rituals, expensive offerings to be made, and a great deal of anxious waiting. The god did not simply speak from the ether. His will was made known through a physical process, usually involving the portable cult statue, which was kept hidden in a sacred bark, a type of boat shrine. On festival days, a team of priests would hoist this heavy shrine onto their shoulders and carry it in a procession. This is when the magic happened. A petitioner could ask a yes or no question as the bark passed. The priests would then be pushed by the god spirit, lurching forward for yes or stumbling backward for no. The statue itself might appear to nod its head in agreement or recoil in refusal. It was a divine game of red light, green light. You ask if you should launch a new military campaign and then hold your breath to see if 24 priests are compelled to move forward in unison. A lot was riding on their apparent coordination. For more complex questions, the process was even more opaque. The high priest would enter the Holy of Holies alone into the deep darkness where the god resided. He would emerge sometime later, his face a mask of solemnity, and deliver the god's response, almost always a cryptic, ambiguous verse that could be interpreted in multiple ways. And this, of course, is where the system was ripe for manipulation. Those priests carrying the bark could easily, with a shared nudge and a stumble, guide the god's answer in the direction they or their high priest desired. And a high priest emerging from a solitary communion with a god could essentially invent any prophecy that served the temple's interests. Historians still argue about the sincerity of the oracular priests. Were they true believers swept up in a religious ecstasy? Where they genuinely felt the divine will moving their bodies? Or were they cynical political operators, masterful illusionists, who knew that spectacle and ambiguity were the ultimate keys to power? The truth, as always, is probably a complex mix of both. The priests at a major hub like Siwa also had an unparalleled intelligence network. Pilgrims brought news and gossip from every corner of the known world. The priests would have been intimately aware of the political landscape and could tailor the god's pronouncements to achieve a specific outcome. The oracle at Siwa was less a mystical hotline to the heavens, and more the ancient world's best-informed political consultancy firm, complete with dramatic special effects. This practice wasn't limited to grand state questions at famous oracles. A more common form of divination was available to the average person. You could write 2 opposing questions on scraps of pottery: should I buy the ox? And should I not buy the ox? And a local priest would draw one before the local god's statue, revealing the divine will. By controlling the interpretation of the god's will from the grandest question of war to the humblest question of marriage, the priesthood could steer the ship of state from a safe and untouchable distance. They could anoint a king, sanction a war, or settle a succession dispute, all with the unassailable authority of a divine command. It's a miracle any pharaoh got anything done, having to constantly check in with a group of priests who spoke only in riddles and always seemed to think the gods wanted a bigger temple. The priests' control over the spoken and unspoken word of the gods, delivered through the dramatic lurch of a sacred boat or a cryptic whisper from a darkened shrine, was a cornerstone of their power. But sometimes the gods didn't just send messages, they delivered themselves. They would choose to manifest their divine essence, not in a cold statue of gold or stone, but in a living, breathing, four-legged vessel. You now leave behind the world of human prophecy and political intrigue and step into the truly bizarre, and for the Egyptians, deeply serious realm of the sacred animal cults. This was a world where a pampered bull could be more revered than a high-ranking noble, and where vast underground cities were filled with millions of mummified cats, ibises, and crocodiles. Your journey takes you to the ancient capital of Memphis. Here you witness the single most important animal in all of Egypt, the Apis bull. This was not just an animal sacred to the creator god Ptah. It was believed to be the living physical manifestation of Ptah's own Ba, or spirit, on earth. When one Apis bull died, the search for its successor was a national event of supreme importance. Priests would scour the herds of the entire country, looking for a very specific calf that matched a divine checklist of markings. The Greek historian Herodotus tells us the bull had to be black, with a perfect white diamond on its forehead, a marking in the shape of a crescent moon on its side, and a lump under its tongue shaped like a scarab beetle. Finding such an animal was a cause for nationwide celebration. From that moment on, the chosen calf lived a life of unimaginable luxury. It was housed in its own lavish temple, fed honey cakes and the finest grains bathed in warm water, and attended to by its own dedicated staff of priests. It even had its own harem of the best bred cows. This bull had a better diet and a more luxurious apartment than 99% of the human population. It was the ultimate bovine rags to riches story. Every twitch and moo the Apis made was interpreted as a divine omen. When the bull eventually died, and if it lived past a certain age, it was sometimes ritually drowned to avoid the indignity of a slow natural death. The entire nation was plunged into official mourning. The massive animal was then mummified with all the care and expense of a pharaoh, and laid to rest in a colossal granite sarcophagus in a sprawling underground catacomb known as the Serapeum of Saqqara. The reverence for the Apis bull was an elite state-sponsored cult. But as you move forward in time, especially into Egypt's late period, you witness this belief explode into a massive popular industry. You see a common person, perhaps a farmer or a craftsman, wanting to petition a god for help, a good harvest, recovery from sickness, success in business. He might pray to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, or to Bastet, the fierce and protective cat goddess. To ensure his prayer was heard, he would purchase a votive offering, a physical gift to the god. And the most popular gift was a mummified animal associated with that deity. This created a demand that was almost industrial in scale. Temples dedicated to specific animal gods began to operate huge breeding centers. You would find farms with thousands upon thousands of ibises, falcons, dogs, and most famously cats, all raised for the sole purpose of being killed, mummified, and sold to pilgrims. Recent CT scans of these countless animal mummies have revealed a rather dark side to this business. Many were not old animals who had lived full lives. On the contrary, they were often tiny kittens and baby birds, just a few weeks old, their necks deliberately broken to meet the relentless demand. Some of the mummies discovered by archaeologists have turned out to be fakes, a few random bones, or even just a bundle of reeds and mud, cleverly wrapped in linen to look like the real deal. It's a bit like finding out the expensive organic divine offering you bought at the temple gift shop is actually a cheap counterfeit. Egyptologists still argue about the true nature of these late-period animal cults. Was this an expression of genuine fervent piety and a deep-seated love for animals as divine messengers? Or had it become a cynical commercial enterprise with priests running what were essentially mummy mills to profit from the hopes and fears of the masses? The scale is simply staggering. Archaeologists have uncovered vast catacombs for these animal mummies that beggar belief. At Saqqara, there are galleries stuffed with the remains of an estimated 8 million mummified dogs. At Tuna El Gabel, tunnels are packed floor to ceiling with up to 4 million mummified ibises and baboons. It is estimated that in total, over 70 million animal mummies were created in this period. From the singular pampered god bull of Memphis to the millions of mass-produced bird mummies, the priests managed the entire relationship between humanity and the animal kingdom. They were theologians, divine zookeepers, and wildly successful entrepreneurs all rolled into one. The industrial-scale mummification of millions of cats, dogs, and ibises was in the end just a sideshow. It was a practice born from a much older, more sacred, and infinitely more detailed priestly craft, the preservation of the human body for its journey into eternity. All the skills the priests honed on those unfortunate animals were perfected in the waybet, the pure place, the embalming house where they performed their most vital and visceral service. You now steel yourself and step past the linen curtains of one of these workshops, a place of strange science, powerful magic, and the overwhelming scent of spices and mortality. You are about to witness the 70-day process that turns a fragile corpse into an eternal vessel. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's a thick, heady mixture of sweet perfumes, natron salt, and the faint coppery tang of blood. The Wabet is not a sterile laboratory, but a functional open-air tent or a simple mud brick building positioned near the necropolis on the desert's edge. The men working within are a specialized class of priests. The chief embalmer, directing the entire operation, wears the haunting mask of a jackal, taking on the role and authority of Anubis the god who embalmed Osiris himself. The process begins with the most famous and frankly most gruesome step, the removal of the brain. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence and consciousness. The brain was just cranial stuffing. A priest takes a long bronze rod with a hooked end and forces it up through the deceased's nostril, puncturing the thin ethmoid bone that separates the nasal cavity from the brain. He then vigorously whisks the tool back and forth, scrambling the brain into a liquid slurry. The body is then tilted, and the liquefied brain simply drains out through the nose. It's a rather unceremonious eviction. No, thank you for your service. Just a hook to the head, and out you go. They clearly didn't think it would be needed for the trip. Next, the internal organs. These moisture-rich organs are the main engine of decomposition, and they have to go. A priest known as the cutter uses a razor-sharp blade of Ethiopian obsidian to make a clean incision along the left flank of the torso. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus recorded a fascinating piece of ritual theater associated with this act. After making the cut, the other priests would supposedly curse the cutter and chase him away, throwing stones at him. This was likely a symbolic way to absolve the team of the sin of mutilating the body, heaping all the blame onto one designated scapegoat, who is then ritually punished. Through this incision, the embalmers reach in and remove the stomach, the liver, the intestines, and the lungs. The one organ they carefully and deliberately leave behind is the heart. It was the key to the final judgment, the spiritual hard drive containing a record of every deed done in life. These removed organs were not discarded. They were considered too important. They were cleaned, dried in natron salt, and then individually stored in 4 sacred containers known as canopic jars. Each jar had a lid shaped like the head of one of the 4 sons of Horus, the divine guardians of the viscera. Imseti, the human-headed son, guarded the liver. Hapi the baboon guarded the lungs. Dua Mutef, the jackal, looked after the stomach, and Kebesenuef, the falcon, protected the intestines. Now the real preservation begins. The empty body cavity is rinsed with palm wine, which acted as a mild antiseptic, and then packed with bundles of linen and fragrant herbs to help it keep its shape. The entire body is then buried under a mountain of natron, a naturally occurring blend of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate harvested from dry lake beds. It is a powerful desiccant, and for the next 40 days it will draw every last drop of moisture from the body's tissues. It's the world's most extreme spa treatment, a 40-day salt bake. You emerge very, very dry and well preserved, though you probably wouldn't recommend it to your friends. After the 40 days, the body is exhumed from its salt bed. It is now a shrunken, leathery, but completely arid husk. It is cleaned, anointed with precious oils, and the shrunken torso is plumped up with more linen sawdust or even peppercorns to create a more lifelike form. Then comes the final, painstaking stage wrapping. A team of priests works for over 2 weeks meticulously wrapping the entire body in hundreds of yards of fine linen strips. They wrap each finger and each toe individually before moving on to the limbs and torso. As they work, other priests read magical spells aloud and protective amulets, the scarab beetle for rebirth, the eye of Horus for healing, are tucked into the wrappings at precise locations. A thick, dark, resinous liquid is often poured over the bandages, acting as a waterproof sealant. Historians and archaeologists still argue about the exact composition of this goo, debating whether it was a simple tree resin or a more complex magical cocktail. The 70-day ordeal is finally over. The priests have defied nature. They have conquered decay and produced a perfect, eternal home for the soul ready for its final journey. The 70-day masterpiece of the embalming priests is complete. The body is now an eternal fortress. Its senses have been magically reawakened by the opening of the mouth, and it is adorned with every necessary amulet. But all of this, the meticulous preservation, the sacred spells, the vast wealth of the tomb, was merely preparation. It was the process of packing the luggage and buying the ticket for the most important journey of all. The final test was not of the body, but of the soul. You now drift away from the world of the living, leaving the silent tomb and the sun-baked sands of the necropolis behind. You find yourself accompanying the spirit of the deceased, the shimmering bird-like Ba, as it navigates the treacherous landscape of the underworld, heading towards the final terrifying moment of truth. The journey through the Duat. The Egyptian underworld is not a peaceful procession. It is a perilous odyssey through a realm of fire and shadow. The Book of the Dead, that essential papyrus scroll, prepared by priests and buried with the deceased, acts as a divine map and phrasebook. To proceed, the soul must pass through a series of gates or pylons, each guarded by a fearsome knife-wielding demon with a terrifying name like He Who Lives on Serpents or Blood, Drinker from the Slaughterhouse. Only by knowing the correct passwords and secret names learned from the scroll can the soul pacify these guardians and pass through unharmed. After successfully navigating all the gates, the soul arrives at its final destination, the Hall of Two Truths. The scene before you is one of awe and terror. It is a vast, silent hall at the far end of which sits the great god, Osiris, Lord of the Dead, on a golden throne. He is the chief judge, flanked by the goddesses Isis and Nephthys. Lining the walls are 42 other divine judges, a grim jury, each one ready to interrogate the soul regarding a specific sin. The deceased is led forward and must perform the negative confession. Addressing each of the 42 gods by name, the soul must declare its innocence of a particular transgression. I have not stolen, it proclaims to one. I have not made anyone weep, it tells another. I have not been deceitful, it insists to a third. It's the most stressful job interview in history, with 42 intimidating interviewers, and you have to convince every single one that you were a perfect angel your entire life. Once the confession is complete, the true climax begins. The jackal-headed god Anubis leads the soul to the center of the hall, where a great golden scale stands waiting. On one of the golden pans, Anubis places the heart of the deceased, the very organ the embalmers so carefully left in the body, the record of one's true character. On the other pan, he places a single pure white ostrich feather. This is the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth, justice, and cosmic harmony. The ibis-headed god Thoth, the divine scribe, stands by with his palette and reed pen ready to record the official verdict. All those years of living, all the good deeds, and all the secret sins are about to be weighed against the unshakable lightness of truth itself. If the heart is pure, free from the weight of evil deeds, it will balance perfectly with the feather. The scales will remain level. A cheer might go up from the gods. Thoth records the verdict, Makaru, true of voice. The soul has been justified. The god Horus then takes the vindicated spirit by the hand and leads it before the throne of Osiris, who welcomes it into the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, a perfect, eternal version of the Nile Valley, with no famine, no sickness, and no death. But if the heart is heavy, burdened by lies, theft, and cruelty, it will slump down, outweighing the delicate feather. And waiting eagerly by the scales is the single most terrifying creature in the Egyptian imagination, Emmet the devourer of the dead. She is a monstrous chimera, with the head of a crocodile, the torso of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, a hybrid of the three animals most feared by the Egyptians. As Thoth records the guilty verdict, Ammit lunges forward, her great jaws snapping shut on the sinful heart. This is the final death, the true end. There is no hell of eternal torment, only the absolute terrifying oblivion of non-existence. Your soul is annihilated forever. Historians still argue about how the average Egyptian approached this judgment. Did they believe one truly had to be sinless, an almost impossible standard, or was it more about faith in the system, a belief that knowing the right spells and performing the negative confession correctly could magically purify even a heart that was less than perfect? It is the eternal question of faith versus works. This final dramatic ritual is the great equalizer. A pharaoh who ruled as a living god, who married his own sister to preserve his divine blood, and whose body was laid to rest in a treasure-filled tomb, still had to face this ultimate test. All the priest's rituals could do was get his soul to the door of the courtroom properly equipped. In the end, his eternity rested on the simple weight of his own heart. And so our journey through the shadowy corridors of the past comes to a gentle and quiet close. The echoes of chanting priests, the glint of a heretic king's golden treasures, the silent gaze of a pampered bull, and the terrifying snap of Amit's jaws all begin to fade, receding into the soft sands of time from which they came. The world of divine siblings, fallen pharaohs, and dark rituals dissolves back into the whispers of history, a story now told. The immense weight of upholding cosmic order is no longer on your shoulders, and the fearsome judgment of the gods is a universe away from the quiet comfort of your room. The only things that matter now are the gentle rhythm of your own breathing and the soft darkness that invites you toward a peaceful and untroubled rest. Feel the stillness settle around you as the last remnants of ancient Egypt's grandeur and gloom drift away, leaving only a profound and tranquil silence in their wake, as deep and as peaceful as a sealed tomb beneath the eternal, silent stars. Sweet dreams.